Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. This is Newcastle Fast FM with myself, Richard Coupland, and alhamdulillah, today's show is the From Darkness to Light show. A show every single day of the week at 6 o'clock until 7 o'clock. And alhamdulillah, I'm sponsored by Richard McLeod, as you can see here, and various different sponsors for the Fast FM show. So, alhamdulillah, on today's show, as you can probably see from the topic, what I really wanted to touch upon was to do a short discussion on some of the basics of the sciences of Hadith. And why I really thought this was important because I feel like many of us that are converts, many of us that are reverts, many of us that maybe are born Muslim, but we're new to practicing the religion, we hear about Hadith and we hear about Hadith, it's mentioned, but many of us don't necessarily know what does it mean. And many of us don't necessarily know is, okay, how is a Hadith authentic? How is a Hadith Sahih? So on today's show, I wanted to talk a bit about what is a Hadith, talk a bit about what is an authentic Hadith, how do we know the Hadith is not authentic, and also touch upon some books that you could, inshallah, read, some books that you could study that will increase you in knowledge on this topic. So to begin off, to start off, is the question is, what is a Hadith? Now, the scholars of Hadith, they defined Hadith to refer to five things. The first thing they said it is what is narrated from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his speech. Second thing, in his actions. Third thing, in his tacit approvals or silent approval. The fourth thing was his character, and the fifth thing was his appearance. To the scholars of Hadith, this is what a Hadith can refer to. Something that is attributed to the Prophet, that is about something he said, something that he did, something that he approved of, how he looks, or how his character was. These things, they call it a Hadith. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that whatever is attributed is authentic, is correct, etc. But it's something that is simply attributed to the Prophet, which forms a part of his speech, part of his action, or his approval, etc. So something that is a statement of a companion wouldn't be referred to as a hadith technically. Something that's a statement of a scholar wouldn't be referred to as a hadith technically. So take an example of each category. If we look at the first category, something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. Many hadith we can think of. One of the famous hadith is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam he said that indeed actions are by intentions. The hadith of Umar in Bukhari and Muslim. Indeed, actions are by intentions. This is something the Prophet said, and something he said. Something for the second category would be something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. For example, it's narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at the beginning of the salah, he would raise his hands to the shoulders or to the ears and say Allahu Akbar. Him raising his hands to the shoulders is something that he did and has been narrated in a hadith that he did it, and something that we learn from and we take. The third category, a tacit approval. Now this comes from the understanding that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, nothing would be allowed in his presence that was forbidden, and he wouldn't stop the person. Meaning that if something wasn't allowed and somebody did it in his presence, the Prophet would tell them that it's wrong and he would stop them. And this is because the reason Allah sent the Prophet and Messenger was in order to teach the people, in order to clarify things for us. So if somebody did something wrong in his presence, he would then correct them. Or maybe someone did something in his presence and he didn't forbid them from it, meaning that it's allowed. So for example, a companion ate a type of gecko, lizard, or animal in the Prophet ﷺ's presence, and he didn't forbid him from eating it. Rather, he said that it's something that he personally doesn't like to eat. So here we would learn that, okay, if the Prophet didn't forbid him from eating it, it must mean that it's something that is allowed. So it's his approval, his tacit approval, something's done in his presence, and he allowed it. Many hadith, a companion does something, a companion says something, The Prophet laughs, the Prophet remains silent, the Prophet doesn't stop the person from doing it, showing that it's something that is allowed in the religion. The fourth thing would be something from his character. So, for example, Aisha radiallahu anha, she said in Bukhari that the character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the Quran. And something from his appearance. Number five would be, for example, it's narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a thick beard, a beard that is thick. So that's something from his appearance, his beard. Something else from his appearance would be, for example, his height. It's narrated that he wasn't very tall, neither was he very small. Rather, he was at that average, ideal height, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is something from his appearance. So that's what hadith is. Many of us would probably already know that. You know, you read that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did something, he said something, his appearance, how the companions described him. All this would be a hadith. Now, before we talk about the different categories of hadith, what's an authentic hadith, what's a hadith that is weak, I really want to recommend some beneficial books for the listeners to dive into and read. And I've divided it into three different categories. Category one are some beneficial books available in the English language that are good introductions, are good to cover the various topics of hadith. The second are some scholarly works that are advised to study with a student of knowledge or with a scholar, in which you would take the simple book, then you would take a higher level book, then a higher level until you reach the highest level. And then the third category was some books that are very good at dealing with doubts that people have about hadith, doubts that people have about the tradition. So, with the first category, some beneficial works to read in the English language. A very good read to start with, which is not very difficult to read. It's very obviously you can see it's very thin. It's called An Introduction to the Science of Hadith by Dr. Suhaib Hassan. This is a very beneficial read as it's very short, only like nearly 60 pages. But it breaks down the sciences of hadith in a very short, simple manner. It's a good introduction. It's a good opportunity for you to learn what's an authentic hadith, what's a weak hadith, what some of the different classifications. It's obviously in English, simply written. In some points, he does bring some in-depth topics, which is beneficial, but may be difficult. But it's a very good short read, An Introduction to the Science of Hadith by Dr. Suhaib Hassan. The next recommendation is the book called Asul al-Hadith by Dr. Bilal Phillips. Asul al-Hadith. So this is very good. Whereas this dealt with something called Mustalah al-Hadith, Hadith terminologies. This deals with the entire science. So this book will give you definitions. It will give you the history of Hadith. Was it written down in the time of the Prophet? How were the books compiled? What are the famous books of Hadith? When were they written? How were they written? It's going to give you about the sciences. How do you know Hadith is authentic? Has a very nice section in here about muhaddithat, women scholars of Hadith, female scholars of the Islamic tradition who learned Hadith, taught it, transmitted it, and you'll find their names in the books of Hadith. So Asul al-Hadith by Bilal Phillips is a good read. It's a good summary of everything. Touches upon every single topic in a very good manner. And I think the third recommendation I would give out of the books that I have is the following: Hadith Terminology and Classification by Muhammad I can't even say his name, but Hadith Terminology and Classification. This is a very good book. This book is brilliant. That it's very succinct and technical. He breaks it down step by step. And what's really good about this is that each section about Hadith, he'll give you plenty of examples. So, for example, a Hadith that is mu'allaq, meaning mu'allaq is a type of Hadith where there's a gap between the compiler and the next narrator. So, for example, between Imam al-Bukhari and the next narrator, there's a gap, there's someone missing. They'll give you very good examples of hadith that are like that. And that would be a type of weak hadith because the chain isn't connected. This is very good. So those are three recommendations. Now, if somebody wanted to study the sciences of hadith in a ilmi way, in a student of knowledge manner, in a similar way in which they would study if they went to abroad to visit the scholars. There are a number of works in which the scholars put together. One very good introductory level is a poem called Al-Manzuma, Al-Manzumatul Bayqaniyah, the poem of Imam al-Bayqani, in which it's 34 lines of poetry, in which he summarized the hadith terminology in this poem. So you can obviously have it in Arabic, but you can get it in English. And in English, alhamdulillah, they published the explanation of Sheikh Saleh ibn Uthaymeen, in which he explains the points in this book. As well, there are some beneficial explanations online. But this is a good poem that the person memorizes. You memorize these 34 lines of poetry. So whenever somebody asks, okay, what's an authentic hadith? You memorize you know the line of poetry about authentic hadith. You can record it simply and easily. This is a good book. The next level, I have it, but I can't find my book version. The next level after Al Bayquniya is a person would study. Generally, it's recommended to study the book Nukhbatul Fiqh by Ibn Hajar al Asqalani. Nukhbatul Fiqh is a higher level book, and which is a very beneficial book, a very good introductory book, which the person memorized, the person learned, the person understood well, they would become very high in the sciences of hadith. Nukhbatul Fiqh by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, that's a good book. Then the level after that is you could have the Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah. The Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah is good. Or you could get this book, اختصاء علوم الحديث by Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah. And the famous explanation by Ahmed Shakir is here. Um, this has some تعليقات of Sheikh al-Albani rahimahullah as well. But نخبة اختصار علوم الحديث by Ibn Kathir is a good book, similar to the Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah. And then the higher level after that is you could study the Alfiya, the thousand-line poetry of Imam al-Iraqi. And as well, I've got a book by Suyuti, 2 volumes, which is also a good book. So that's if you want to study it in knowledge, you start with Bayquniya, Nukhbatul Fiqh, then you could do the Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah, or you could do the Ikhtisar al Hadith of Ibn Kathir, and then you could study the thousand-line poetry of Iraqi or other scholars. Now, one book that I do want to recommend to people to pick up and read, and it's really good, as you can see, I've put notes here about it. It's a big book, as well. It's nearly 600 pages. But this book by Dr. Mustafa Sibai is hugely beneficial. It's called The Sunnah and its role in the Islamic legislation. This book here is going to give you a full breakdown of the sciences of hadith, everything about it. But what's very beneficial here is that he discusses and refutes the doubts of different groups. So, for example, he refutes the doubts of the Orientalists, the non-Muslims that studied Islam, and they brought doubts about the sciences of hadith. He'll respond to them. As well, he'll respond to the Quraniyun, the people that say we should only follow the Quran, we don't need the Sunnah, we don't need the Hadith. He responds very well. He responds to different groups amongst the Muslims, whether it's the those that call themselves the Shia. He responds to some of their doubts about some of the companions that they have, and different things. So it's a very beneficial book in which he'll talk about the different sciences of Hadith. And again, there's many others by Mustafa al-Azami. He has some great works responding to Orientalists, responding to doubts about the Hadith. So those are some beneficial books. I'll drop them in the chat for people to benefit if they wish to purchase them. But what I wanted to really touch upon today is what is an authentic Hadith. We talked about what a Hadith is. It's something the Prophet said, he did, he approved of, his appearance, or his character. How do you know a hadith is authentic? An authentic hadith, hadithun sahih, has 5 criteria. 5 things that must be met in order for the hadith to be accepted. The first is a fully connected chain of narration. Ittisal sanad, or it's muttasil, meaning it's fully connected chain of narration. Meaning, for the person compiling the hadith to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the chain of narration has to be connected, meaning that each person, they met each other, they lived at the same time, and that they narrate the hadith directly from one another. So they say, for example, سمعت, I heard from this person, or أخبرنا, the person narrated to me this. Each person has to do this in the chain of narration. So, if you in Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, the chains of narrations, they're like this. They're fully connected from the Imam al Bukhari up until the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They're fully connected all the way. There's no breaks. There's no missing person. There's no person who we don't know who he is. There's no person who is narrating in a non-clear way from another person by saying "anna qala." That's how we know that the hadith is authentic. And this is something that is very different to if you look at other religions. If you look at the Bible, you look at Judaism, you look at Christianity, you look at Hinduism, you look at Buddhism, many of their works and many of their books, you don't know who authored them, or you know who authored them, but there's no connection between them and the Prophet of Allah, or between them and the story happening. They weren't there, or they didn't meet a person there. Rather than narrating stories that they heard, for example, in the New Testament, various Gospels, narrating stories that they heard, but they don't tell you who narrated them. That would be a weak hadith in our view because we don't know who's narrating it. Is the person trustworthy? Is he a liar? Um, is he a person who has a bad memory? Does he make mistakes when he writes in the books? We wouldn't know. So the first condition is a fully connected chain of narration, meaning that every single person from the compiler to the Prophet ﷺ is there. The second criteria is that the narrators that I mentioned, they have to be like adil, they have to be trustworthy. They have to be trustworthy and truthful, meaning that people that are known as truthful people, trustworthy people, they're not people that are known as liars. They're not people that are known as sinners. They're not known as people that have bad etiquettes and bad character. Rather, they're known to be truthful and honest people. And there's a big, grading system and discussion about how is somebody truthful, etc. But the key thing for us to know is that this person isn't somebody who does major sins, is a person who is obscene, a person who is a liar, a person who is not trustworthy or truthful. They must be that. That's the second criteria. The third criteria is dhabt, meaning accuracy in their narration. That they must be accurate in their narration that they're narrating. Meaning the person could be very amazing, righteous, truthful person, but he's very bad at narrating hadith. He has a bad memory, or he makes mistakes often. So the person has to be trustworthy, and the person has to have good accuracy in his narration of hadith. So, for example, there's two types. There's the accuracy of the qalb, meaning the heart, meaning from his memory, meaning that if he narrates the hadith, he narrates it quick and instantly, and he doesn't make mistakes, and he's accurate when he narrates it. That's the first type. And the second type is the dhabt of the book, of writing, meaning that this person, maybe he doesn't memorize it, but he writes it down and he narrates from his book when he teaches. When he writes in his book, he has to be accurate in his writing. His book can't be somebody who can easily be changed or tampered with, or he loses his book, or it could be burned. Rather, he has to be a person who looks after his book, writes correctly, and writes the hadith correctly. The point is that we need to know that when he narrates the hadith, he's known to be somebody who has amazing memory, somebody who narrates things accurately, and not somebody who narrates things inaccurately. These are the three characteristics that would make the chain of narration correct. Now, the other two, al-ilal and ash-shadh, they are two criteria that are often more difficult to find. So the fourth criteria that the hadith needs to have is that it cannot be shadh, meaning it cannot be opposing other authentic narrations. And what this means is a situation in which an authentic narrator, somebody who's trustworthy, authentic, he's good, he is thiqa, he's got good memory, he's authentic, he narrates something that opposes other authentic narrators. This would mean that his narration is shadh, because even though he's good, but he's going opposite, he's opposing other authentic narrators, or he's opposing the majority of other narrators. This would render the hadith weak, and it would be shadh. The fifth criteria is ilal, which is a hidden defect, and often these hidden defects are difficult to find. One example that I've read in the books is an example of the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, where he was with one of the companions. And the companion stood on his left hand side, and the Prophet ﷺ moved him to the right hand side to pray with him. As we know, a person should stand on the right of the Imam if there's two of them. Now, in one narration, it's the in one narration in one narration it is the other way around. The companion stands on the right and is pushed to the left. So we learn what the scholars did when they looked at all the chains of hadith, when they looked at all of the narrations of the hadith. Imam Muslim, I believe, did this. He found out that one of the narrators made a mistake in which he mixed up moving from the right to the left. He mixed it with left to the right, so he made a mistake. But this is something that takes research, takes effort to look at all the narrations in order to conclude that the hadith is sahih. So if a hadith is concluded to be authentic, it must meet these five criteria: fully connected chain of narration, trustworthy and truthful narrators, accuracy of the narrator, it cannot oppose other authentic narrations, and it cannot have no hidden defect within it. And if this hadith fulfilled that criteria, it would be authentic. But the question comes, okay, if that's a hadith that is sahih, what is a hadith that is hasan? Often we hear that this hadith is hasan, it's fair. What's the difference between these two levels? The reality is that they're both, everything is the same in the conditions except for the accuracy of the narrator. So a hasan hadith has to have a fully connected chain of narration. The narrators have to be truthful and trustworthy, cannot oppose other authentic narrations, and cannot have any hidden defects. The only difference is the accuracy is a little less. So for example, for Sahih, the narrator is A star, A plus. But maybe for the Hasan, he's B, C plus. He's, Sahih, he's 85%, 90%, 95% authentic. But for the Hasan, he is, 70, 75. So his memory is still really good, his accuracy is still really good, but it's not at the highest level of narrators, which means that it's an authentic hadith. We can accept it, we can work with it, but we need to realize that it's slightly less in its authenticity. And these categories were made obviously for us to work with and understand the hadith when grading. So when we look at the hadith that is sahih, it has different levels of authentic. There are different levels within the sahih. Some are very authentic, some are less authentic. The most authentic hadith that is sahih, the scholars mentioned, is that which is narrated by Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. If it's narrated by both of them, then it's seen as the most authentic because they were very stringent when they collected their narrations. They were very, particular in what they narrated. The next level is that which is narrated by Imam al-Bukhari alone. The next level is that which is narrated by Imam Muslim alone. And then the next level is that which is not narrated by Imam al-Bukhari or Imam Muslim, but it meets their criteria of authentication. And again, the next level is that which is not narrated by Imam al-Bukhari, but the hadith meets his criteria. And that which is not narrated by Imam Muslim, but the hadith meets his criteria. And the seventh level would be a hadith that is authentic, but it doesn't match any of the criteria of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. That's the Sahih. Five conditions after we met. The Hasan, five conditions, just the accuracy is a little less. But if we take a look at the hadith that is daif, the hadith that is weak, a hadith that is weak is basically anything in which out of these five conditions there's an issue. So, for example, a hadith could be weak because the chain of narration isn't fully connected. So, for example, um, a tabi'i, a student of a companion, narrates something that the Prophet ﷺ said. This hadith would be mursal. It's disconnected because there's a missing of the companion. Many of the scholars would say this is weak. Similarly, if, for example, Imam Malik in his Muwatta, he often narrates, Imam Malik narrates, it's reached me that the Prophet said this. So, for example, he says that it's reached me that the Prophet said that I've left behind you two things, that if you hold to them, you'll never go astray, the Kitab of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet. He says that it's reached me. So he doesn't give his chain of narration, rather Imam Malik narrates from the Prophet directly. This would be considered weak because Imam Malik never met the Prophet ﷺ, and we don't know who he's narrating from directly. As well, the hadith could be weak in the chain if a narrator narrates from somebody but he doesn't narrate explicitly from him. Rather, he narrates very generally. So he says, qala or an. So it's been said, he said, from. These are very general terms. And the reason why somebody this isn't acceptable because maybe they're hiding a narrator in between. So, for example, it says that Richard said that Muhammad said X. However, Richard, myself, maybe I didn't hear it directly from Muhammad. Maybe I heard it from Adam, but I want to hide Adam in the chain. So I just say Muhammad said. I'm not lying because Muhammad did say that, but I didn't hear it directly from Muhammad. So again, that would be a weak hadith. Hadith could be weak because the chain of narrator, the narrator in the chain, he is not trustworthy. He is maybe a liar, maybe somebody that wasn't truthful, maybe somebody that was known to make sins, or somebody that didn't have honest, truthful character. That would make the hadith weak. Similarly, maybe the narrator had a bad memory. The narrator became senile when he became older. The narrator used to mix up the hadiths, maybe used to make mistakes. All these things would render the hadith weak. Similarly, if it was shadh, it contradicted other narrations, it would be weak. So, for example, hadith that is munkar, hadith that is rejected, is a hadith in which the hadith is narrated by weak narrators and it opposes authentic hadiths. So somebody who's weak and not authentic, he's somebody who's got a bad memory, somebody that's not trustworthy. He tells us something that contradicts what's authentic. That would be munkar. It would be rejected. And obviously, the fifth condition is al-ilal, the hidden defect. If a hidden defect was found, it would render the hadith weak. So the point is here that the sciences of hadith is a big topic, and it has many different criterias, many different terminologies, and many different conditions. But it's something that is very beneficial to learn, something that's very beneficial for us to study. And if we take the time to read some of the books that I mentioned, we would be able to understand the sciences of hadith a bit more, understand when a hadith is mentioned that Al-Albani said it is Sahih, or Imam Ahmed said it is Hasan. What does that fully mean? By learning about these conditions of the hadith, we can really understand it. By doing that, we can really understand is what is hadith and what is the science all about. So, inshallah, the books that I mentioned, if there was one book I think that somebody wanted to read out of all the books, that they could only read one book, I would recommend to read Usul al-Hadith by Bilal Phillips. It's in depth, but it's also easy to read and easy to understand. But he covers all the different topics. He covers a wide range of things. definitions, how was the hadith compiled, how was it transmitted, how did we classify hadiths, what do we do when the hadith conflict, how do we grade hadith, what are the biographies of the scholars of hadith, what is the literature available, female scholars of hadith. That is something that we could read. PDF is online, the book you can buy online, and we would really benefit from this, um, from reading the sciences of hadith. So inshallah, that's what I wanted to touch upon today, is a bit about the sciences of hadith and how they work. Tomorrow, inshallah, when we come back, I wanted to really go through some of the books of hadith. So, for example, we have here Sahih al-Bukhari, a book written by Imam al-Bukhari. I want to go through some of these books and discuss the authors. Discuss the authors, when did they live, what books did they write, why did they write these books? For us to become a bit more accustomed, so for example, somebody may say, oh, the hadith is in Sunan Abi Dawud. Now, Sunan Abi Dawud, when Imam Abi Dawud, he made that book of hadith, his Sunan, he didn't make it conditioning that every single hadith that he puts in there is authentic. Rather, the aim of his book was to compile a book that deals with the issues of fiqh, the issues of Islamic law. Many of the scholars said that if you had the Quran and you memorized Sunan Abi Dawud, you would have a lot or majority of the evidences for fiqh. So his book is, the book of prayer, the book of charity, the book of business transactions. That's how he structured it. The book of fasting, the book of Hajj, the book of Ramadan, in which he would bring all, most of the narrations to deal with Islamic law, whether they're authentic, whether they're not authentic, for the scholar to learn this book and be able to give Islamic rulings based on this book. So often if you want to learn a position that's within the various madhahib, within the various Islamic schools of law, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanafi, Hanbali, often you'll find a lot of the evidences in Sunan Abi Dawud. For example, according to the Malikis, the Shafi'is, Hanbalis, and many of the scholars, is that you should you can lift your hands, or you can do raising the hands more than once in the salah. But according to the Hanafis, you should only raise the hands at the beginning of the salah once, and you shouldn't do it afterwards. If you pick up the Sunan of Imam Abi Dawud, and you go to the topic of raising the hands in the prayer, he'll bring you the hadith of Ibn Masud, in which he says that in which he prayed and he only raised his hands at the beginning and he didn't raise them afterwards, and he said that this is how the Prophet prayed. But he'll also bring you the hadith of Ibn Umar and other companions, in which it's narrated that the Prophet used to raise his hands in more than one place in the prayer. The point is that this is why Imam Abi Dawud made his book. His goal wasn't to make a book that is 100% authentic. His goal was to make a book that compiles many of the evidences in relation to Islamic law, so that a person can read this book and they can learn the different evidences that are used. And alhamdulillah, it's a very beneficial book. So inshallah, tomorrow we will discuss that. Then on Thursday, inshallah, I'm going to be joined by my wife, and we're going to be doing a very beneficial topic. We're going to be talking about, practicing Islam, living Islam whilst working at the workplace, whilst working in a corporate environment. That's what we're going to discuss. As well, we're going to talk about the roles of the mosques in Islam, the role of the mosque in a community. And on Friday, inshallah, I'm going to be joined by my brother-in-law, in which we're going to discuss a number of different topics. One of them, which is going to be an interesting topic, we're going to talk about his experiences of doing Ramadan whilst going to school, and also doing school at home during the lockdown. How has his experiences been? Has it been beneficial? Has it been difficult? As well, we're going to talk about reciting the Quran in Ramadan, the importance of it, and talking about how his recitation's going and some of the beneficial stories that he's read upon the way during his recitation. And inshallah, we'll touch upon a number of different topics. So that's going to be this week. And tomorrow, next week, inshallah, I will be having some more guests on. Inshallah, some more revert brothers, convert brothers will be joining me, sharing their experiences, sharing their stories. But do check out the previous shows on Newcastle Fast FM, on their YouTube page and their Facebook, in which I had different guests on. Sergio, a brother from Spain, shared his story. Brother Alex, who lives in the northeast of England, shared his story. Brother Kiri, who's originally from London, shared his story. And Brother Kin, who is from Hong Kong, shared his story to Islam. And alhamdulillah, there was some very beneficial discussions, and it was good to listen to their stories, so do check them out. Inshallah, I will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. talking about the books of Hadith and the scholars of Hadith. Jazakallah khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.